Hey everyone, welcome to our Insurgent Feminisms conversation, part of our general series on how to write about war. And today's topic, a very intense topic, very urgent, I think, in my opinion. We're calling it gaslighting as method and ways to resist it. And I'm super excited because I think this conversation is long overdue, at least for me personally, but also because I am with two of my absolute closest friends. And it's just very strange and very cool at the same time. And Suchitra Vijayan, who is a frequent guest, of course, and a co-founder of Radical Books Collective. So that's not a big surprise. She's a writer. She's a lawyer. She's an activist. She's a lot of things. And then Suzy, welcome for the first time on one of our events. And Suzy, when I've met was I when I met her. First of all, we went to the same college. We graduated from Bard College, and you were an avid filmmaker, traveling to Iraq, to Palestine, to various places, making documentary films. And then, since you've kind of put those same social justice energies into being a social worker, so welcome. And what brings us all, unites us today, is that both of you are in this fabulous anthology, Insurgent Feminisms, Writing War. And Suchitra has a long piece, in fact, to do with gaslighting. And then Suzy, you have a brilliant profile of Anne-Marie Yasser, the Palestinian filmmaker. So let's just start off. And I'm going to say very quickly. So I've been doing a lot of launches, and I've been trying to promote this book, but I've received some feedback, which is that when I'm actually doing these launches, I'm not talking much about the book at all. I'm just kind of obsessed with Palestine and all the other stuff that's going on. So I'm going to try to say very quickly why we arrived at this particular topic, gaslighting as method and ways to resist it, why I felt it was important to bring the topic of gaslighting into conversation. So I think what I really want to emphasize is that when you're working on an anthology, which was attempting to subvert a lot of existing structures, makes you start thinking about the challenges that some of the writers in the book may have overcome. So we have so many women journalists, artists and writers, lawyers, researchers in them, and all of them are profoundly shaped by a kind of fine-tuned sense of injustice, sexism, coloniality around them. And I cannot emphasize enough that every single contributor in this book is working against the grain. And I think gaslighting is fundamentally a process through which one is forced to doubt and question their own reality, their belief systems. And a book like Insurgent Feminisms is a testament to the many contributors who are working past these very masculine, patriarchal, colonial ways in which wars and conflicts are represented. So I just wanted to sort of open with that. And I thought I could start by all of us sort of laying the groundwork by talking a little bit about what the term means to us. When did it become meaningful as a concept? I don't think the term's been around in our lives as much as it is now. I think it has. I think with the Me Too movement, things have potentially brought it more into focus. And I thought maybe I would have Suchitra go first, and then I will also weigh in, of course, because she has an essay in the book. It's a long essay called An Autopsy of Me Too in Two Parts. And I remember when she was working on it, and even the work itself had a double edge. Not only was she exposing the ways in which the victims were being gaslit, but she was also very anxious about the impending gaslighting that she was going to experience, and I think she did. And so maybe you can start, and then Suzy, you can tell us after as well.
Thank you for that, Bhakti. So I'm just going to kind of lay out the broader categories of what gaslighting is. Gaslighting is an incredibly new terminology for me. It's a terminology that I kind of became familiar with not before 2017, 18. Along with gaslighting, there are other ideas and concepts that go hand in hand. Another one is tone policing. I hadn't heard the word what tone policing meant. And I think these ideas and concepts go hand in hand. Not that none of us felt these things, but it's as if you had an intuition for ways in which your language was policed, the ways in which your ideas were devalued, the ways in which you're consistently told that this is not your time, or that your reality is not the way it is, or you are crazy, or you just don't understand. I think the word gaslighting kind of, um, I also love the fact that now the gaslighting is kind of expanded to kind of encompass all of these experiences in a very specific way. Um, and the piece that I'm discussing today, which is in the anthology, was initially written as a response to what was happening soon after Me Too. This was an incredibly in response to an incredible Instagram handle called Seen and Heard, which started exposing Me Too stories in the art world. And the two things were happening, and I think the gaslighting begins from the beginning. Seen and Heard was anonymous, but it had consistently started documenting the ways in which these great figures and icons in the art world, photography world, were predators, and the kind of harm that they had caused to a lot of young women and others in the community. Initially, even the Instagram handle itself was gaslit. Initially, it was said that it's anonymous, it's not essential. And even as I write the piece, an artist in the Indian art scene very clearly says, yes, they also dismiss this Instagram handle in person, but inside closed doors, for the first time, the silence has been broken. So my piece was very specifically about this photographer called Mahesh Shantaram, who has a long history of deeply unethical um, photography practices, where he centers black and brown bodies and exploits them for his work. But his name, again, what is very important to understand is that Seen and Heard was an anonymous account, which means that it wasn't naming all of the names. They would describe they would describe the artist and the work, and then the abuse that was faced by the survivors. In Shantaram's case, his name was never mentioned, yet he self identifies and comes out and writes a piece called I Know No Means No, and I Understand It. And his response to this anonymous thing was basically saying that it was basically gaslighting these women into saying, oh, this is not true. Yes, my ideas were bad. And what this man had actually done is, as a photographer who was pretty well, at least pretty established within India, he went around asking young female photographers to strip,
Oh my
to
God.
go to their campuses, give talks, and then he would reach out to them and say, hey, I'm working on this series. Would you want to take your clothes off for me? And he felt this was okay. And the project that he was working on was to photograph women naked to show their power. Again, why you would want to strip a woman to show her power was completely beyond me. Anyways, he writes this not apology, he writes this response to this anonymous accusation. And very quickly, his response on Facebook, where he writes this, becomes an open ground to demonize the women. People call him a hero. Midday, a newspaper in India, publishes a profile of how this is how one writes an apology. And every time, and by day two, his entire section where he refutes all of this becomes a horrible place, toxic misogyny, where other photographers are using this to criticize women. And when I do step in and say, Mahesh, this is not okay, he's dismissive towards me. He says, I find your ideas interesting, but
Hmm.
that was a moment for me to realize that this gaslighting and this kind of Me Too does not just translate to the way he treats female photographers that he comes to terms with, but it also translates to how he treats the subjects that he photographs. And that then starts me trying to find out who these women are. And a lot of them are anonymous. We have proofs, but we kept them anonymous. Only a fraction of the women who we spoke to, we even published. And then we go on to write about the ways in which he also exploits his subjects. He asks an African American woman to take her clothes off. She agrees to, he photographs her, and she asks him not to publish the photograph. And yet he goes ahead, publishes it, shows us in exhibitions. And when we finally asked him, gives some kind of an explanation, but in reality, he's failed all forms of ethics.
Mm.
But what happens post is that Mahesh says, I was jealous of his career and that I went after him. And then he says there is going to be a response. And then he writes a newsletter saying that the Polis Project, the organization that I founded and run, and where the piece was published, was an anarchist organization, that they have a vendetta. So he sends it as a newsletter, which was forwarded to me. He says nasty things about me in groups, of which I have screenshots of. And then he says, I'm going to write a response to this. The response never came. But he starts asking people to go after me and write takedowns of me. And one of the person that he reaches out to me, interviews me, and then that piece never comes out. And since then, this man has continued to be nasty to me on Twitter. He says nasty things to me. The photographers who know about his, editors who know about his work continue to. Of course, when this happened, there was a huge backlash against him, but he's found his way back. He's now again commissioned. He again calls himself a feminist. The harm he did to these women was never addressed. And now he's back to being commissioned by the New York Times. The same art photographers who were quiet for a while went on. The organizations like Al-Qazi Foundation, other organizations like Agence France Presse, which was his agency, other large photography organizations that are run by the Podar family, all of them who supported him said nothing publicly.
Mm.
And now he's found his legitimacy back. He's on the thing. So
Mm.
now I always knew, even when I was writing this, that this was going to happen. But one had to write this, realizing that all of this was going to happen. But the reality is, not only has people like Shantaram gone on to create immense damage in
Mhm.
terms of what they've done ethically, in terms of the body of work, but what happens as a consequence. And not to mention that the men who were part of his community, writers, editors, his friends, would again start malicious rumors, would
Mm.
again talk to men in my life about, oh, why is Suchitra doing this? Oh my God, this paragraph is none of it publicly. There's
Right.
not been a single piece of work that publicly challenges the work that I've produced. But all of this going back insidiously. And then you realize the ways in which silence and impunity are maintained. Because I do not rely on any of them for my work, my legitimacy, so I could survive this. But
Yeah.
see how someone who relies on these very same networks could have never written this piece or gone on, given how incredibly powerful and toxic these networks of power and privilege are. So I'll kind of stop it at that. I think I've gone too long already.
It's okay. Yeah, I'm remembering all this stuff now. I had forgotten almost. But to bring it back around is the idea that gaslighting is not only a deliberate way in which you make yourself, which you are forced to doubt yourself, question yourself. It's also that it works. That you do doubt yourself, that you do start to begin to feel a little bit unsteady, and it's so much of this is about how do you refine your footing in a world that's like structurally is just it's everywhere now in particular. But Susie, I'm going to let you say something.
Yeah, I think that, and it also speaks to how threatened he is by you. I think that speaks to your power on some level, even though he works to make you feel disempowered. So I think that's something to be said. Um, for me, in my work as a social worker early on, when I was working with queer and trans survivors of violence, I would see gaslighting show up, and this is really where it originated with intimate partner violence. And so it was interesting to learn in depth how it was used, but within a queer setting. Because I think a lot of people, especially when there are two people who are identified as women in a relationship, and how that plays out, and how that often is not taken seriously. Or if it's a sort of what we would call a butch femme dynamic, the more masculine person would often be identified as the perpetrator and the gaslighter. And so when folks got police involved, which unfortunately would happen sometimes, the police would come and they would immediately arrest the more masculine appearing person, and not, regardless of, let's say there was physical evidence of some sort of physical attack. And so that's where I started to think about it more. And when I would counsel people, I would often learn about how uh, gaslighting worked in terms of the manipulation, the creating a sense of doubt, questioning your own sanity, and what people would do to survive that too, right? So often people, when people say, why don't you get out of this sort of as we understand it, DV relationship, it's now the term is IPV. And it's very difficult when you're constantly being told, well, you are the person who was involved in perpetrating the violence. And so for me, that was where I started to learn more in depth how it affected this aspect of society, which often isn't talked about, right? I mean, relationships themselves aren't acknowledged, or, now it's more progressive. We have marriage, but, initially 20 something years ago, this wasn't something that was discussed. We understood IPV to be about, an abusive cis het man attacking or manipulating physically, emotionally a cis straight woman. And it also, of course, shows up with gay cis men as well, right? And so in that circumstance, this all the sort of assignment of how gender is expressed plays a part in how this gaslighting works as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's intense. I think I wanted to. Yeah, I think when I was coming across this term, and I would say it's been even less than a decade since I have actively become, used to it around me, or to actually ask myself, have I experienced this in some way? And then, yes, I think there are moments, and I want to highlight, like, there is a lot of debate around the fact that this term should not really necessarily be used in the structural sense. I think all of us disagree with that, but also that one should not get away from the interpersonal dynamics of it. I mean, family, relationships, workplace, and so on. So I think, my first experience of it is, of course, being in an interracial relationship, an interclass and intercultural relationship, and which is always fighting against the grain of something. When the family environment is has a certain structure, and you have disrupted a certain structure, and because I'm not demure, or because I'm someone who knows my mind, it's like, there is always this thing, like, if I think something is racist, I am overthinking it, or lighten up, this is it's not racism, it's just teasing, it's light, it's just like that. And intellectually, of course, I know that I am right. Intellectually, I know I'm right, but it's impossible, because it's hard to respond to that in the moment, and the moments accumulate over the years, despite a supportive partner and things like that. But also, you start to really think, like, am I really, it's like, must everything be correct, must everything always fall in line, in a certain way? So things like that, I think, was when I first started to think about the term gaslighting, because I could feel myself trying to find the strength to push back, and to retain my moral compass, or my sense of ethic, or whatever it is, right, despite all this pressure. So that was one. And then I think, trying to gain tenure in the great universities in the United States, it is just one long experience of gaslighting, because the way it is endemic to the structure. The individuals blame the structure, but the structure is held together by individuals. And they will say, sorry, like, that's just how it is, that's just how we do things. And what happens during tenure, it takes you 5 or 6 years to get tenure. You come in, and you're immediately kind of under scrutiny for how much you produce. And even I know I produce more than most people, and that I came into that job. I got that job because I was doing a lot of scholarship outside of academia. I was running a magazine, all these kinds of things. But as soon as I came in, I got a rap on my knuckles to go the traditional route. And there was always this thing, not doing enough, not quite doing it right. And everyone who goes through tenure will say, and that's all I can say to like people who come after me, the younger scholars and so on. It's just like, it is just endemic to the structure. It makes you doubt yourself. It makes you think you're not doing enough. It makes you think like no journal is prestigious enough, no book or press is prestigious enough. And it works to kind of create compartments within you, and you really feel quite bludgeoned, and it takes a lot. And of course, I had supportive friends, supportive colleagues, a few, very few in number, that pushed me to get through it. And also just baseline fear of failure, like, my god, just do it, get it done, don't fail. So but there is a sort of intense gaslighting that one doesn't deal with, and they all pretend they're there to mentor you, to support you, but really they're there to critique you. And it really takes a huge toll. It took me a long time to come out of just thinking about that, and what I lost along the way, and to rebuild and things like that. So I think that's how I arrived at the particular understanding of gaslighting. And I feel like I'm going to throw out another question, and maybe Suzy, you already touched upon this a little bit. But one of the reasons this topic was important for centering insurgent feminisms as a volume and so on is that it appears, one would say, I don't have any data, but women, queer, and trans people are more impacted than others by this. And there is this phrase, and friends will use it too, like, I'm gaslighting myself. Stop gaslighting yourself. And I wonder if we can unpack this a little bit, and think about what this means in the context of gender and sexuality. Whoever wants to.
I mean, I can say, just like you're talking about the sphere of academia, society in general, if you are not heterosexual, it is not meant for you in terms of how we are raised, right, and socialized. So from the beginning, I would say, I mean, I'll speak for myself, when one realizes, let's say, at a very young age, that you like Beth and not Tommy, type of thing, you quickly try to convince yourself otherwise, because you don't want to be outside of what's seen as normal. And I think even as a young child, you understand what that is immediately because you're taught that. So there's a way that, if you want to use the phrase about gaslighting oneself, that you try to convince yourself otherwise constantly. And that takes a toll on you if your whole life is like that. I think for younger people now who don't even think about this as much as we might have in our generation, I'm sure the psychological effects would be much different. So, but if we're going to talk about, across the spectrum, LGBTQ plus, IA plus, we can obviously go to trans and non-binary folks, right? And how they are on a daily basis. I mean, now we're in a place where, there's gay marriage and, it's more socially acceptable, which has its own train, right? And then what it means for folks who don't identify within those labels, and how there's so much pushback, even from older folks, my age and older, who find their own discomfort with people not liking these boxes. And so I think that's where, trans and non-binary folks are dealing with not just cis straight folks, but other folks within the LGBTQ community who are uncomfortable with them not falling in line. So I think that's also part of where they are also gaslit. So for a trans or non-binary person, they're literally told, not everyone, of course, but there's lots of circumstances, that's what there's such a high rate of suicidality, that who you are isn't real. And if you experience life a particular way and you believe, you find the courage in order to say who you are, and everyone, including the people who are supposed to love and protect you, tell you that this isn't true, that you're sick, that you're twisted, that something's psychologically wrong with you, that now you're not only a threat to the family structure, but you're a threat to other people. right? You can't play the sports you want to play. You can't be in the bathroom you want to use. You can't date the people you want to, everything about you is a threat. So that is counter to who you might understand yourself to be, and what kind of effect that has on you is completely damaging. When you were talking about academia, I mean, what they were doing was chipping away your confidence over and over and over again. And the same is true here. It chips away. I mean, if you're even able to get yourself to a certain place, it tells you that that can't be true. So these are long-term effects, and you can just look at the numbers especially for youth, or for Black trans women who are killed regularly. The numbers are so high for that, and those are the ones that get reported. So I'll just stop there.
Suchitra, you wanted to follow up on that or add something? Oh, I think you're muted, but
No, I mean, I think Suzy has said everything. I don't want to. Yeah, it was perfect.
yeah. And I think what I wanted to add, and I think one is more familiar with the sort of gaslighting that women, people who identify as women, experience, because there's like a slew of shows and magazines who will talk about heterosexual relationships, is that. But I think also, just at a level of the way society is structured, I think appearance, one's appearance, I think there's an immense bodily harm that happens with being gaslit about your appearance. And I think it's an unusual pressure, I think, on everyone, but I see it on straight women in a very particular way that it's just kind of like it's an impossible thing to break out of. And also brings me to this idea that, yes, gaslighting, it sounds very mild to say, oh, gaslighting causes self-doubt, causes anxiety, but I think it causes harm to the body. It can really harm you, like as stress can harm anybody, but it can lead to intense nervousness, eating disorders. It's just like the list is long. So it's a very toxic, intense harm. And I wanted to bring in this article that you shared, Suzy, which spoke about, so we talked a little bit about gender, but this article is called Anti-Palestinian Racism and Racial Gaslighting, where I'm seeing the term racial gaslighting being used. It's by Yasmin Abu Laban and Abigail Bakan. And they had a great thing where they're saying this is how racial gaslighting operates. And I'm just going to quote. It said, first, groups, not just individuals, can experience a denial of their lived experience in reality, and this creates harms. Second, the technique of gaslighting is overwhelmingly directed at those with less power and works to maintain the status quo, which in settler colonial contexts means supporting the colonial project by diverting attention from its oppressive character. And third, gaslighting involves a form of blaming the victim, typically by pathologizing those very people who resist their oppression. I thought this was extremely helpful, not only because we do want to talk about the student protest, but maybe we can throw in a sort of, we can just talk a little bit about people of color more broadly, or things that I'm always thinking about is immigrants. What sort of gaslighting might be specific to that? How would we think about migrants and people of color within this same framework?
I think one of the things that you first told is that your grasp of reality in the place that you left behind and the place that you've arrived is never complete.
Yeah.
Your knowledge of what you left behind now is no longer relevant because somehow you are discredited because you don't live there. Somehow, that's assumption that somehow only people who live, you have to be on the ground in order to have an analytical understanding. Sometimes some people do, sometimes some don't. You could be on the ground and still not understand. We saw this with the reporting that the Times did, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq. You could be in these spaces and still refuse to see the reality that's happening. So if you're immediately discredited about the knowledge that you have about the home that you left behind.
Yeah.
Second, of course, is the fact that you're constantly told that you don't understand because you're not American. You
Hmm.
don't understand because you don't understand racism. You don't understand how America works. You don't understand the culture. You don't, not realizing that all of American culture is global culture.
Yeah.
Like America globalized, just as it globalized war, it globalized incarceration, it globalized oppression, it also globalized its culture. I know as much about Friends or Sex in the City or Girls as any other American because that was my, and yet I am constantly excluded from. And the most, I think the thing that most immigrants often are told is about how we speak. Either we speak very eloquently, there's an absolute confusion that we can speak certain things, or if we defy stereotypes of either being incredibly wealthy or just migrant undocumented laborers. So it's also the sense of performance of a certain kind of reality. And this is something that even immigrants themselves, the diaspora itself, kind of reproduces. You can be this rich, successful Indian person who came to this country with $10 in their hands and now look. And I think there's also these stories that we tell ourselves in order to, which is not the reality.
Yeah.
History memory is local. So I think there's this constant rewriting. I think this goes back to the same thing, the erasure of history, the erasure of the migrant experience, that not all migrant experiences are the same. How one arrives is different, how one leaves is different, capacity for success for everybody is not the same. And I think that gradation itself is somehow, so as I said, the you are denied knowledge to both the home that you left behind and the place that now call your home.
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing that I abhor more than the assimilation pressure of assimilation. And I think Susie can talk more to that because you grew up, but you have a migrant identity as well, an immigrant identity as well. But just upon arrival, like what this idea, this what is expected, what are the levels of assimilation you're expected in, how it's like, it's again, it's about the lightness. You could try harder. And what's his name, the guy who made Hamilton, Lin Manuel Miranda, he is like always promoting this idea of the good migrant. It's like, what, every society is made up of good, bad, the middle, whatever. Why must the migrant always be so good? So one is forced into some a different morality, a completely different morality than anybody else. And I think as far as racism is concerned, you touched upon accent. It's just, it's everywhere, it's embedded in all fields. And then when you're woman and you're of color, it's like a whole other thing. Who gets to speak in a room, who gets to walk into a room, who gets heard? All these things are always working against you. Anyway, Susie, go ahead.
I mean, with Lin Manuel, I think it's interesting. I'll just say this because he's Puerto Rican, and then there's a whole thing around Puerto Ricans in terms of the Latino community or Latinx community in America, because of them being a Commonwealth, them having citizenship versus other Caribbean countries that do not have that versus other Latin American. There's so much there. And why does he do that? I'm not excusing it because they want to be seen as good, right? I mean, who are they fighting towards? Who are they trying to gain acceptance towards? So for me, so for me, it's very different. My father was born here. His father came from Palestine, and he was one of those stories where he came with 5 cents in his pocket, and this is the lore, right? And was able to make very good, with an 8th grade education type of thing. And some of it I can see, obviously, it's been passed down, and some of it I'm like, this is an amazing movie, right? And we all want these stories.
Yeah.
When we talk about, I mean, I'm so far removed from that, so I feel like you two really speak to it more eloquently. But
Thank you.
you're welcome. but I see it in obviously in New York City, and then I see it in my own family's history and its relationship to being seen as successful in American culture in New York City. And then as Arabs in this country, what does it mean, right? And when did they come? How did they assimilate? How were they accepted based on certain aspects of their identity versus not, right? So there's lots of things there, and it's very different than people who are immigrating now or fleeing or refugees at this point, especially
Yeah.
from who are Palestinian. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's for those that don't know, Suzy is half Irish and half Palestinian, which, as the joke goes, she's doubly Palestinian. She's fully Palestinian.
I'm also
Um,
Lebanese in there, so it's a big
all right, but the
yes.
Irish love to claim the
Yes, they do.
Palestinian.
Yes. I'm all for it. I'm all for it. It's a good white side.
Absolutely. But I think, at least from that's all I can think about is what's going on
Yeah.
right now in Palestine, the genocide in Gaza in particular. I just all day been haunted by the torture and killing of Dr. Bush, and the fact that, talking of migration and borders and things like that, Dr. Hassan Abu Sita has been detained in France. He's not going to be let in. They're putting him back on a flight back late at night. It's just out of control. And the videos of the student protests in the US and in France, and some, I think those are the only, actually, I'm just seeing US and France. I'm not seeing any other. But the US in particular, UCLA, and in New York City, NYU, CUNY, and Columbia. It's been a bloodbath. I mean, the UCLA, a literal bloodbath, absolute bludgeoning. I mean, today there are more just like blood everywhere. Just they've been beaten, and mass arrests in New York, and everywhere in the sense of media and politicians. Biden walked away when someone said, "Will this change your policy?" He said no, and he even kind of laughed a little. It's like, what a joke. No way. And they have this whole discourse going of outside agitators, presenting the students as mobs. The NYPD released all this pictures of what they found in the students' room, and they found like the Oxford Introduction to Terrorism, and they were like, "This is the book we found." And it's just, the gaslighting is everywhere. They are being recast in various ways. They're going to end up with records. It is out of control. And I wanted to start with you, Suchitra, because I know you were in Columbia a bit and you were at NYU a bit. You're teaching courses in both universities at the moment. Do you want to say a little bit of how this is going? And then, if we all dare, let's talk a little bit about everybody being an anti-Semite these days.
I don't know if it's a privilege at this point in time, but I have the privilege of teaching two remarkable group of students, not the universities, the students. I teach at both Columbia and NYU. I'm a part-time faculty in both these campuses. And I've been in touch with my students. I taught Columbia last semester, so I'm in touch with them. But I'm also right now teaching at NYU, which means some of my own students right now are at these encampments. And I just want to say how incredibly proud and moved I am by all of them. The amount of political, moral, ethical clarity. But at the same time, the kind of violence and gaslighting that they have been subject to. And it's just unbelievable. And I just want to give you two examples. One, on the day of the first arrest in NYU, I got texts and saying that, oh, things are going down. And when I went there, my husband and my child decided to come with me. They were like, okay, this was around 6:15 when the first group of cops started coming in. And by the time they got there, I didn't go in because I was with my very young daughter and my husband. And I could see the cops walking in, just marching in. And I saw my daughter's face, and my daughter has, as a child who was born and raised in New York City, even for her seeing all of that, she just, I could see. And my first thing was, if my daughter was feeling this way, here were students out there. And that was the day when the news about the Al Nasser hospital mass graves that turned up about the ties, the zip ties. And just as so morning you read this news, you have the kids on the encampment, fighting for what is important. The police are now walking in, and I see a bunch of NYPD cops come up with this entire trash bag full of like ties. They drop it, and then you see the tie and you realize the connection. And they're like, and then one guy says, there's a trash bag full of zip ties. And then they're like, oh, we need more. And something in me just, it was just so disgusting. I literally had like, this visceral reaction where you just want to throw up. And then, of course, they go in, they arrest Sinan Antoon, they arrest David Ludden, they arrest all of these professors, they arrest all of these students, and it's disgusting. And again at NYPD, again at Columbia campuses, they have denied access to the professors. They've cut food. Like literally right now, we have about hundreds of students who now have been denied access to campus dining, which means, again, it's the untenured faculty that is now running around trying to organize food for these kids. We now know that the NYPD fired a shot on Columbia campus. How dare you? How dare you call cops on our kids? Like, I know I'm saying kids in a very maternal way, but these are students, and how dare you call cops on our students?
Yeah. No. And very quickly, can I add about the zip ties? Because, that same day, like over 48 hours in a run up to that, the mass graves of Al Shifa Nasser Hospital in Gaza were found, and most of those bodies were zip tied. And I remember, like, just that day tweeting, like, everywhere I turned, zip ties, zip ties. And then you were texting me about this thing that they arrived with this whole bag of zip ties. It's just like, just as a, of course, the truth of the actual material fact of what that zip tie is so much more cheaper than handcuffs now. That's a whole new implement and technology. All massacres, genocides require new implements. And not just that, but also just metaphorically to think about this.
I mean, and the violence that they're doing. I think the second that they're also doing is the students at the city college are being charged differently. Columbia students who were arrested were being charged with misdemeanors, while your working class, predominantly brown and black students from city college are being charged with felonies. And today we saw another video being released from Columbia, where really what they're saying is, you as students need to listen to genocide enabling thugs, because even people who commit genocide have good ideas. That was literally the message. And the reality is that students now have realized that institution is them.
Yeah.
It is no longer these buildings, the money, the accolades. And I think the reality is that these students and the faculty who are so bravely standing up will face real material consequences.
Yeah.
They will be told, they will be gaslit. They will be told that all of this doesn't matter. They will be told that what they did was not peaceful. They will be told that they are difficult.
Yeah.
And the reality is that I do believe, I know you and I disagree on this, Bhakti, I do believe the tide has turned. The tide has turned.
No, I want to publicly believe, I want to keep a radical militant hope, as I always say. And I want the tides to turn. It's just coming out. I just want more proof. I don't know, but it'll come.
The reality is, the moment, I didn't see this in Colombia initially, but the moment I saw those faculty in NYU, I know they're a handful, I know it doesn't represent, nobody asked for them. The moment they ran and held hands, this would not have happened. I would not have imagined this happening. Absolutely. And that happened spontaneously.
Let's talk about what's really hurtful in this. There's the physical hurt, and then there's the being told you're anti-Semitic. And I and I know it's easy to say everybody is not anti-Semitic, everything is not anti-Semitism, but it always gives me pause, and not to sound like, who are we joking about? Cynthia Nixon, who said, my my wife is Jewish, I'm raising Jewish children. Same here, right? I have Jewish kids who to me could look Jewish, but they could also look kind of Arab, and they have Arab names and foreign names, and it's, I very much want them to be steeped in that particular culture. Not, we are not religious, but to be steeped in their Jewish heritage, as much as is possible. So when I have been in Palestine activism for as long as my adult life, right since 9/11 was when most people, as far as I know, my age, got radicalized. We knew who went which way. um, you know it does something in me stops. So when I was sending out newsletters from the Radical Books Collective and Warscapes, and I got a slew of letters. Oh, you claim to be into literature and book clubs and all this kind of stuff, but you're just an anti-Semite. You're just an anti-Semite. And it just, you really begin, it worries me. I don't think I am. And it's just so shocking to have that leveled at you. I know that the term has been diluted, appropriated. I intellectually know all that, but it is a very big charge to cope with. So yeah, I don't know. Susie, do you have some thoughts on this? You grew up in the US, I think. As a Palestinian, maybe you've heard it
I
way
mean, I
more.
think that it on some level, it's right to sort of pause when someone calls you that, because that's, first of all, that's not who you are, but you also know that anti-Semitism is wrong, right? So you don't want to be associated with something like that. And then you can get intellectually to the place of that people are using it to the point where it cheapens the actual meaning. And that's what we're seeing over and over again.
Mhm.
So for me, I grew up actually in a predominantly Jewish area, and grew up, not to be like my best friend is black, but it kind of sounds like that. Like I grew up going to bar bat mitzvahs. Like I understand the culture on that level. It's not mine, but I understand it. And when I'm talking about gaslighting, I'll never forget when I was 12 years old, I got a ride from a classmate of mine who was Jewish, and her father asked me, "What is your last name?"
Mm.
And I said, "Oh, it's Palestinian." And he said, "There's no such thing as Palestine." And I was so naive because I believed adults, but I was also irritated. Like I knew that he was kind of fucking with me, right? And so I said, "Well, that's not true. That's not true. I know that's not true. That's where my grandfather's from." And he said, "No, no, there's no such thing as Palestine. That's Israel. And maybe your family's from Jordan." And I didn't have the capabilities to like keep going in a debate with this man who was gaslighting me as a 12-year-old. But it was probably my first like awareness of like, oh, it's not safe to sort of to say who I am, to acknowledge this heritage of mine. And I also grew up steeped in Holocaust understanding. Like I learned a ton about it. My dad like knew every detail of it. He could have taught a class on it. So I knew deeply about the travesty of it. And so when people use the phrase anti-Semitism, I've never been called that specifically, but I'm sure there are thoughts directed at me when I've been outside, like you're talking, I was doing this work before 9/11, and when 9/11 happened, forget it. We were all a bunch of anti-Semites because
Totally.
we were fighting for Palestine. And so in my early years of activism, I did a lot of work with people who would now be in Jewish Voices for Peace, but it wasn't there then. This is like 20 some years ago. Um, and the vitriol we received, where I was actually assumed to be Jewish because everyone else around me was, and they were stating that they were, I didn't disclaim that, was shocking even then. And so it was interesting to both be perceived as that because of my Palestinian identity, and then because of this assumed projected identity as being a self-hating Jew. And so, although I was not that, and I'm not an anti-Semite, I can feel the power because we're raised in the society, at least in the East Coast, I won't say in the South,
Yeah.
where you learn from what happened and you don't repeat that. It is as bad as just being anti-Black. Like you don't feel that way. You don't believe in those horrible beliefs. So when somebody does throw that at you, I think it is hurtful. And it also is gaslighting in the sense that we know intellectually what we're doing is not based on hating Jews.
Yeah.
And so that's, I'll throw it back out at you guys, but that's where it becomes gaslighting in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me also what's unique is that my father's sister married a Jewish man. So forever it's been held as a precious identity. So it's always been in my life, which is rare for Indians. And so yeah, so there is a true sense of shock, that not to mention that so much of you know all the kind of scholarly work one does on genocide, on violence, on war, and so on and so forth, is derived from that particular history, which is a singular, extraordinary, just horror of an event, and it's just being used now in such in such problematic ways. It's really deeply, deeply distressing. Suchitra, I don't know, is there a particular history with this term?
I think I spent the first 17 years of my life in India, where you really don't, I didn't, and this was just before 9/11. I went to college weeks after 9/11. I'm starting my undergraduate studies weeks after 9/11. So for me, anti Semitism, Islamophobia, anti Palestinian racism, anti Arab, all these are ideas I learned not in India, but as a young person who was in a different country learning all of these ideas. And for me, it became very clear very quickly that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, any kind of racism, or Zionism, all of these ideas were inexplicably linked. You cannot talk about anti-Semitism without talking about Islamophobia. You cannot talk about
Yeah.
Islamophobia without understanding that it's viscerally connected to white supremacy. And since 17, I have lived in predominantly white societies as a minority, as another. And I've lived in New York since 2010. So I've lived in the city for 14 years of my life. This is a city where I've raised my family, I've built a life for myself. And I understand intuitively that white societies, while they are accepting of Zionism, tend to be very, very anti Semitic. I now
Mhm.
have a young child in school, so I see the ways in which a predominantly white society, even in a New York City, which is often called a Jewish city, I mean, New York is not a Jewish city, but the idea that somehow Jewish people have power in New York City is something that's often spoken about. Even in a city like New York, we cannot discount the fact that anti Semitism is real. I remember Trump coming to power, coming back from India, and seeing swastikas on these news kiosks. And the first response was, these are communities, people who have survived the Holocaust living in the city. What would their response be? So I understand, for me, as maybe this is where the immigrant experience comes, where you viscerally understand, just as I understand anti Semitism is real, I understand Islamophobia is real. I understand racism as real, what it does to you. Now, conflating that severe anti Jewish sentiment that exists in all white societies with resisting Zionism is not going to keep Jewish community, whether religious or otherwise, safe. It is not. It really is not. Today, I think what we need to teach, and for me, I'm thinking of this as a mother. And as I said, I mean, you
Yeah.
have to teach our children the realities of racism. You have to teach them to acknowledge and realize what racism and living in a society that is white and racist is like. You have to teach them to acknowledge and see what Zionism looks like. You have to teach them what Hindutva looks like. You have to teach them what violent ethno nationalist ideologies look like, that they divide. And it's just become impossible for us. And I mean, again, it just feels weird. I don't want, like, I don't want to talk about anti-Semitism as if by saying I also have Jewish friends. That's not the point. The point is that all of this is viscerally connected, and whatever conversations or the narrative that is being peddled outside, conflating resistance. I mean, we all have to resist Zionism. It's not, it's
I
not
know.
and that is not.
It's an emergency at this point. I
And
mean,
right now, Zionism is the biggest threat for Jewish people around the world. I've said it. Like, if this means I'm going to lose my job, let me lose my. I don't care. Zionism is the biggest threat to Jewish people around the world.
yeah.
And if we do not realize that and have honest conversations, and the fact the United States government is today criminalized any criticism of the state of Israel, then I think it's important for us to acknowledge it. If not, then if we cannot name the problem that we are fighting, we cannot fight it effectively. And the fact that so many of us are afraid of even stating the problem now because it has come real material consequences.
Mhm.
And I think that's where we are right now.
Yeah, and you know that from the river to the sea, you know, I sat with my Palestinian Lebanese friend, and we literally were like, let's really think about this. Like, what am I saying something wrong? Is this bad? Because it's so beautiful to me. It's such a beautiful, it makes complete sense geographically. And of course, it also turns out, as like, does it really have whatever this intent that they are claiming there is? And of course, it doesn't. But also, it makes sense, the threat around it, because the Likud party used to have it as their line, which was like, from the river to the sea, Israeli sovereignty or something across the land, whatever it was in Hebrew. So yeah, and that's another thing that was giving so much pause, at this point. But yeah, you said it. You should have the last word on this. It is an absolute emergency. You have to call it. It's just a silencing mechanism. It is deliberate. It is an extraordinary gaslighting. Nobody can say anything. Doesn't matter if you're Jewish. They're arresting you in Germany anyway. It's like, what? They're arresting Jewish kids, Jewish activists. So what does it even mean anymore? Let's call it what it is. I think we promised 1 hour, but let's go a few more minutes, because I wanted to get to the title of our conversation, which was gaslighting as method. And how does gaslighting by media, politicians, or structures of family, can be seen as methodical. I know, Suchitra, that you were reading for a while this book about the New York Times, where you ended up buried by the Times. I don't know who's the writer. You can tell us. So you were kind of thinking about that as like one big structural gaslighting, the way the reporting works. Could you say a little bit?
I mean, I need to actually thank my friend Raj Shekhar, who's a brilliant reporter who wrote the book Despite the State. He actually sent this book to me. We were having a conversation. He said, "You should read it. You should read this book because it's by, I think it's Laurel. I don't know if it's Leaf or Leff, but I don't know how to pronounce it. It's Leff. So this is a book that really just lays out to us the ways in which the New York Times, basically, it's buried by the Times. It's and reading this book, and he sent it to me a couple of years ago, but I've been reading it over and over again in the past 6 months, because then you realize that what they've been doing with Palestine is not new.
Mm-hmm.
Every strategy that they use with Palestine is something that was used, and then the way she breaks it down is she looks at it in the time period between 1933 and 41, what happens 42 and 45, how were the various instances reported. For example, one, not naming it rightly. If you have, say, a massacre happens, like if there was there was attack on the Jewish community, it would appear on page 6. The opinion pieces, which were opinion pages, which was still one of the most powerful pages back then and now, would not have any place to discuss it. So almost every strategy that now they are using against what's happening in Gaza and Palestine was exactly the kind of strategies that they've used. So this is not new. And what's really interesting is that when you talk about gaslighting, before this conversation, I wanted to look at how the New York Times actually reviewed a book about itself. And hold hold, they do the exact gaslighting where then they're reviewing this book. They're saying, "Yeah, she's a journalist. She's not an historian. She
Mm.
put all of these things together, but she doesn't have the prose that really, basically saying that." And I can tell you that the prose is absolutely fine. I've read a lot of history books, and I can tell you that this is historically really well done, well researched. And yet, the way that the Times also reviews a book that is critical of what Times has done, again gaslights a woman who's done this work, saying that she's not a historian. This is
Absolutely.
not poetic prose. Oh, by the way, she could have done this better. And then again, like, not really engaging with the fact that here is a systematic indictment of how the Times, foundationally, excuse my French, fucked up what happened. And if the Times had reported on this, and then you realize, and then when you look at, of course, because it is the Holocaust, you have a book that says buried by the Times. I'm sure this is exactly what happened with Rwanda. This is what happened with Bosnia.
It's
This is
methodical.
what's happening. This is what's happened with the destruction of Tamil Elam. We forget that a lot of another connection that has not been made is that a lot of Elam Tamils will tell you that what's happening to Gaza is what they went through,
Sure.
2010, when the de facto Elam state was destroyed. There was a genocide. They were taken away. They are still to this day. I think a couple of days ago they found another mass graves from what happened during the Sri Lankan strategies. Again, Israel is one of the key architects of the weapons and the strategies used during the destruction of that state. Almost every genocide that has happened in the last, since the Second World War, since the birth of the state of Israel, and its technology has been complicit in every single one of those genocides. So I think it's what is really important for us to understand is that we know the information in front of us, and yet we are constantly told that this is not good enough. And I think if anybody wants, I think this is, again, I wish more systematic studies were done on other genocide. But what the book really does is that it lays out, one, it's historical, so through timeline she breaks down every event that happened, how it was reported by the Times, what information was not conveyed, the ways in which they obfuscate the severity of what's happening, and it's a great way to understand. And the parallels to what's happening to Palestine now is uncanny.
Yeah. Wow.
Let me add in some things here, because I think you know, when we talk about gaslighting and we talk about growing up in this country as someone who is as someone who's BIPOC, as someone who is Palestinian, and we talk about gaslighting and how the victim has to learn the sort of the tools of the perpetrator in order to survive. It wasn't an accident that I was raised understanding the Holocaust. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't an accident that I understood all of the sort of dynamics at play in order to have that knowledge, because I have to have that knowledge in order to also be able to talk about Palestine, because that's the setup here. Because I have to be, because when I talk about Palestine, when we talk about the atrocities of it, we also have to back it up because of the way the system is laid out with all this, you know, wait, I know about this, right? When you're saying, we don't want to open it with, we have Jewish friends. I understand what you're saying, and I was being flippant about it, but there's safety planning and understanding the environment, right? And that's also what is at play when we talk about gaslighting activists as a whole in this country and what's happening right now with these students, because they're all being thrown out with this label as being anti-Semitic. Everything they believe in, whether they're Jewish or not, whether they're Black, whether they're Latina, like whatever they are, they're dumped in a corner because of the fear of their truth. And so they're a threat just as much as you were a threat to that photographer. And
Mhm.
people will come harder. And I think that's where the turn may be going, because the harder people are reacting to these students on campus, to their inability to stop the actual ability to watch the unfolding genocide, like they haven't been able to turn that off. And so we are watching it ongoing as secondary trauma secondary traumatic as it is, we're watching it. We there's no denying it, and that's the ultimate gaslighting, right? Look, we're seeing people be blown to bits, and Biden and all their, sycophants are saying this isn't really what's happening over and over again, and eventually it's gonna. You cannot deny this long term. So I agree that there is some sort of shift, because there's no way. They look like, to be totally blunt, they look like they're actually going insane, and we are gaining more sanity on some level.
Wow. That's great. Yeah, absolutely agree with both of you. We are sort of way over time, but let's hit the resistance bit, if possible. We did say ways to resist it, and I'm not saying this is easy, because yes, we have spoken about interpersonal gaslighting, but also like the structural endemic setup around us, especially if you're working within sort of social justice or pro-Palestinian activism. And I think the question is, how do we retain our moral compass? How do we retain our ethic? How do you practice remaining confident, ethical, clear? How does one work through the fog? And I think one of the ways in which I feel that keeps me going is to reject the notion. So as an educator, and as someone who thinks about politics and activism a lot, or works within sort of what one would call culture work and so on, there is always this idea that you should be working across the aisles. You should be trying to get to people from different perspectives, and not, maybe the word conversion is too aggressive, but to try to allow them to gain a point of view. And over the years, so many students who oppose what it is you're saying, and you try to meet them, you try to modify your language around things, you try to understand, you try to say, okay, that's relevant too, and you learn all this language also of the classroom, which is like, yes, I understand, but actually no, what you just said is super problematic. But I think one way is when, for me, when it reaches this pitch point of feeling like, accusations of anti-Semitism, or accusations that one doesn't really understand the history, or like crazy stuff that goes on institutional listservs and things like that, where you really just want to jump in and say, my God, like, where did you learn your history? Where? And things like that. I think the one thing I find strength in is to only engage with people who think exactly like you, that are tried and tested over time to think exactly like you, and that can fortify. And that's one way to resist at least structural gaslighting. I am in no position to say anything about interpersonal gaslighting or intimate partner violence or domestic situations. Obviously, that requires its own version of resistance and treatment and therapy, all those kinds of things. But when it comes to the structural, I think you need to pause, and you need to just be with absolutely like-minded people, tried and tested over time, and that will give you strength, that will give you joy, that will allow you to breathe. So that's my resistance point. Stop trying to convert others, stop trying to get your message across. Just stop. Just talk to people who are saying the same stuff. Just echo. Suchitra, you have some resistance formula?
No, I think it's just really this idea that for the long time, I think it's kind of very similar to what you're saying, is that for a long time we are told that, oh, as these university spaces, as the work that we do as writers, it is to like, open a discourse. And I think discourse and conversation engagement is the most exhausting three words I cannot.
Yeah.
And this semester, and I think last semester when I was teaching, like 3 weeks in, 4 weeks in, um, October 7th happened. And my priority was back then just to make sure that my students felt this. Back then, there was no classes were speaking. Palestine was not being uttered. My job was to make sure that my students could talk about, this was a course on oral history and human rights. How do you talk about, teach a class on human history, social justice, documentation, and human rights, and oral history without talking about Palestine? And my only job was to make sure that my students could speak about Palestine. And there was this great anguish that the other classes on campus that they were taking, the professors who had either they were their human rights professors were quiet about Palestine, their journalism professors were quiet about Palestine. Ukraine was there, but no Palestine. This semester, I started teaching after bearing witness to 4 months of live streaming of genocide. And the first week of class, the only thing that I said was, this is not a class where we debate whether colonialism was good or bad. This is not a class where we debate if all people deserve human dignity and equality and freedom. If you want to take that, if you want to do that, there are other classes in NYU that you can go take. But my class is not where you're going to discuss that. And I was very clear when I said that. And I also, one of the other things that I said is that we will be discussing violent state ideologies. We will discuss white nationalism and white supremacy. We will discuss Zionism. We will discuss Hindutva. We will discuss we will discuss all kinds of this material, and this is what we're going to do. But this is not going to be a class where we discuss if colonialism was fun, if slavery was beneficial, or no.
Yeah.
And those who didn't want to dropped out. And instead, what I got was a remarkably diverse class of students who really wanted to engage with the material. They wanted to think, they wanted to challenge, they wanted to, and my job was to give them a place, protect them, where they felt comfortable to learn. And I think that was my job. And I think, I don't know if I've done it well, and that's pretty much the only job that I had, and that's all I would do. And I don't care what a Zionist thinks about me. I don't care what a white proud boy, frat boy who's punching students think about me. I don't care. I don't care what a Hindu uncle sitting in New Jersey who is a rabid Modi supporter and hates Muslims thinks about me. I don't. That is not my constituency. I can, through my very little space, protect certain people for certain amount of time and give them certain tools, and that's all I can do. And I understand the limitations of that. I understand how powerless it can sometimes feel, but it's also powerful, and that's all I'm going to do. And I think that is what my way or strategies of resistance is: hold my space in a way that is unabashedly pro-Palestinian, unabashedly radical, and model a behavior that my students perhaps one day believe that maybe these are things that can be modeled.
Absolutely.
Well, and that's huge, right? For those students, that's huge, especially if there are any Palestinians in there, because to be Palestinian in this country, you are gaslit on the daily, right? Forever. When that article talks about just the conversation about the Nakba and how just immediately you're talking this denial, you don't exist, like the 12-year-old story I told you, it's constantly being told your truth is not real. So to even have those little spaces is vital, and will change people to have that kind of safety. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about creating a sense of safety for people. And how do you do that when everything around them is telling them that's not possible? I mean, even for people in IPV relationships, it's unfortunate, but the burden is always on the survivor to be able to have to figure out an exit plan, right? And that's why it takes, like, on the average 7 times for someone to leave an abusive relationship, because it's so difficult, and it's on the it's compounding the trauma for the survivor to have to figure out how to leave. And in this circumstance, it's not just the Palestinian or the Arab community, it's now spread. There are people who are adjacent to that identity but do not hold those identities, and they're now putting it out there and risking their future, right? They're risking their jobs, they're risking possibility, and even jail in some circumstances, as we're seeing. So it is, I don't know how we create a safe space. We can create some more comfortable spaces for people, and for you to do that in your class is extremely important, because those kids outside of that classroom probably feel very vulnerable and unsafe most of the time. Yeah, so thank you for that.
All right, I think we should end on this note. Thank you both. Thanks, Suchitra. Thanks, Suzy, and thanks to almost 1,000 people that are watching. Thanks for supporting us. All right.
Say one last thing.
Yeah, please.
Thanks for having been my space, safe space for so many years. I'm
And
going to
same
start
to
crying.
you.
I'm going to start crying now, but I don't know. I don't know what the fuck I would do if I don't have you, because it's just been such an exhausting few years that, yeah, you do that for a lot of people, and I just want to acknowledge this publicly. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for being the safe harbor for so many of us.
And as I said in the beginning, this is my special special podcast because I have Suzy, who I've learned so much from over the years, who's always so courageous and brave, and of course you, Suchitra, always there. Thanks both of you. Bye.